What have I gotten myself into? A while back I made a defense video on the hit era. I'm British, but era is easier to say, so there. This era encompasses seasons 8 through 12 of the beloved children's classic, Thomas and Friends. Many in the fandom dislike these seasons, and I can understand why. That said, I believe that they don't deserve the hate they get, and so I made my defense. However, if I'm being honest, it wasn't the best made video. I've learnt a lot since then, and that video was me picking episodes with decent morals rather than actually defending the era. That's what this video is for. I'm going to go through seasons 8 through 11 and go over why each one is at least decent. Season 12 is kind of a weird season that doesn't fit into any category, so I won't be covering that here. Now, I'm aware that this video is ridiculously long. Many people here won't be interested in watching all the way through this, and to be honest, that's okay. This isn't something I've made for it to be successful or to get lots of views. I just feel it's important to have all my views on this era in one place, so that people who I debate and argue with have a place to go to find my thoughts. With that in mind, let's push on. The main problem I have with my old defense video is that I drifted from point to point. It wasn't very structured. I still hold many of the points I made as good ones, but they could have been presented better. To stop that happening again, I'm going to split this video into sections. We'll be going over seasons 8, 9, 10, and 11, and in a section for each season, I'll focus on a few things. First of all, I'll go over all the episodes in the season, looking in more detail at 5 or 6 examples that I really enjoy. Every single episode will be covered. Yes, every single episode. In the second section, I'll bring up some of the problems other people have with this season, and some problems I have with it myself, the flaws if you will. And finally, I'll talk about why this season is underrated, taking a look at more general topics such as characters or music. My name is the Thomas Cynic, please subscribe to boost my ego, and let's talk about the hit era. Before we begin, I should mention the obvious disclaimer that you aren't allowed to have your own opinions on this subject. This is the internet, so if you disagree with me, then you are worthless, and I don't want to see you ever again. Since I'm the one talking, I'm correct. We've used up enough time though, so let's get into the episodes of the first season that we'll be defending, Season 8. Well, let's get into these episodes and take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly of Season 8. To be fair to the critics, Season 8 didn't exactly start off on the best foot. Thomas and the Tuba and Percy's New Whistle are both very lackluster. We saw some returning characters in Thomas and the Tuba, but the overall story was badly executed, if a fun concept. Percy's New Whistle was just as poor. It was a boring 3 strikes episode with nothing unique about it, except a semi-decent crash. Anyone else think that the Snowball could be a relative of Boulder? These 2 episodes are certainly not the best opening to a season I've ever seen, but the poor quality was not to last. Thomas to the Rescue, the 3rd episode, is a great one. You know that mediocre extended episode from the Wubba era, Steam Team to the Rescue? Well, this is that, but way better. I'll be talking more about just how dark the tone of Season 8 was later, but this episode is a prime example of it. It feels like there are some real stakes here, and that lends itself to the story very well. Thomas is likeable enough here, and although Diesel is much more childish than he was in Season 7, it doesn't hurt the episode for me. In my previous defense video, I was somewhat critical of Henry and the Wishing Tree, but rewatching it now, I like it. Sure, it's ridiculous that Henry forgets how to pull passenger trains, but the flow of the story is a good one. A couple of Henry's hit episodes revolve around superstition, with the wishing tree and his lucky trucks in season 10. It's a good moral to teach kids that superstition doesn't really get you anywhere. The wishing tree itself is a neat piece of world building, and one that they actually use again, quite rare for this period of the show's history. James Gets a New Coat is a pretty decent episode. James and Percy work well together, this being one of the few times they interact this season. James is very consistent with the classic series, and the shot of him travelling past the canal always reminds me of the story of Narcissus from Greek mythology, a story that fits James perfectly. Not much more to say on this one, it's okay for what it is. Thomas Saves the Day was the first episode of this amazing show that I ever watched, and I'd love it for that alone. But it's also a pretty good one. Annie and Clarabelle were used in major roles for the first time in the show here. This was a great episode for them. They have that Railway Series combination of being mentors to Thomas, but also a source of comfort for him. The subsequent runaway sequence and crash is also very good. The stakes feel high here. This is actually one of the only runaways we see in this era. The team at HIT seem to prefer quick, snappy crashes as opposed to longer, drawn-out sequences. There are both advantages and disadvantages to that, but it was nice to see a proper runaway for once. Percy's Big Mistake is our next episode, and boy is it a good one. Percy's Big Mistake really benefits from the longer runtime. It's a really fun plot. Although I'm never a fan of stupid and wimpy Percy, this episode at least gives him a proper reason to be frightened. I think I'd be pretty frightened too if I thought I was going to be executed the next day. Percy on the whole was managed quite well in this era, but suffered big time when brought into CGI. Let's take a bit of a break there to reflect on what we've seen so far. Of the first 7 episodes of this season, 5 were at least decent, with 3 being downright impressive. So far, does this seem like a bad season to you? It's certainly not looking much worse than season 6 or 7. Sure, the stories so far have all been about the most major of the main characters, but this season was largely going back to basics, and we'll see plenty of secondary characters reappear in the second half of the season. Let's look at some more episodes. Thomas, Emily and the Snowplow is an episode that, until recently, I very much disliked. Rewatching it though, I've decided it's actually fantastic. The camera shots and movements are decent for season 8, and the music uses some really interesting variations of their themes. But the main reason I commend this episode is actually the writing. The essential point of this story is that Thomas and Emily are both complete jerks to each other. They're both completely in the wrong throughout this episode. However, Thomas can only concentrate on what Emily is doing wrong, and Emily can only concentrate on what Thomas is doing wrong. They're so focused on seeing the worst sides of each other that they don't notice their own flaws. They both have planks sticking out of their eyes, but are only focused on the specks of sawdust in the other's eye. This is a great story with 2 flawed protagonists, and both come out of it as much better characters. Don't Tell Thomas, the next episode, is a kind of poor one by comparison. It isn't bad per se, but it does somewhat feel like filler to me. The basic idea is that the engines want to throw a surprise party for Thomas, but they can't tell him about it of course because, surprise, so when he finds out they're hiding something, he gets upset. To be honest, that's a pretty good concept for a story in a kids show, but for me, it doesn't add anything to the characters. It doesn't feel like it has Thomas standard quality. This isn't a bad episode, just one that's a bit boring. Emily's New Route and Thomas and the Firework Display are both episodes that I have massive nostalgia for. I remember watching these 2 when I was about 4 or 5. Emily's New Route is decent. It has good model work and the story works, while not being stellar. Thomas and the Firework Display is much the same. To be honest, I don't really have that much to say about these 2. They're run-of-the-mill, but for mid-season episodes, they do what they need to. I have much more to say about Gordon Takes Charge. Gordon Takes Charge is one of my favourite episodes this season. Before this point, the only time we saw Gordon and Percy interact was at the end of Percy Runs Away and in Percy and the Signal. Here, however, we see their relationship really well developed in a strong episode. The opening sequence is magical and the crash is decent too. Gordon and Percy are both very much in character here. Gordon generally was written very well in Season 8. Spick and Span is our next episode, and it's pretty mediocre at best. It doesn't have all that much to it, nothing significant even happens. Again, it's not a terrible episode that I hate with everything I've got, it's just very boring. That being said, we're halfway through the season now, and only 4 of the 13 episodes could be described as not decent. Even then, there's been no absolutely awful episodes. The one thing that could make this better is if we saw more characters. Oh, what's this? Edward the Great. Bringing back Spencer was a fantastic move. He's a great character. Edward the Great is also a good Edward episode, and the idea of putting the classic fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, into Thomas is a solid one. This is a very simple kind of episode, but I don't think that hurts it. In fact, I think it works in its favour. People complain about the fact that no one believes Edward can beat Spencer, but honestly, who can blame them? How would you feel if your one chance for revenge was to be carried out in a race between Usain Bolt and that guy in a wheelchair from down the street? Probably quite frustrated. This piece of conflict also leads into one of the best moments of Season 8, where Gordon recognises Edward's determination and his praise gives Edward,
"He found Puff he never knew he had."
This episode is another one which is massively nostalgic for me, and so overall it's one of the best in the season. And just when you think this season can't get any better still, we get Squeak, Rattle, and Roll. I love this episode so much. Again, massive nostalgia points, but I also love this episode for its darker tone. The themes of scrap and modernisation were always at their best when Gordon was involved, and this was a great callback to Tenders for Henry. Gordon saying that even if this trip is his last, he'll finish the job, always gets me, because in a way, that's what his character is all about. The episode's moral is also very strong. Just because you're ill or have a disability of some kind doesn't mean your time is up or you're now worthless. It means you need to look after yourself and recognise things in perspective. That's a moral that not many kids' shows teach, unless I'm mistaken. The morals of the next two episodes, however, absolutely are. Thomas and the Circus and Thomas Gets It Right are two very boring episodes. Again, they aren't stinkers, they don't insult the franchise or anything, but it's these kind of episodes that pull Season 8 down from a great season to a merely good one, in my eyes. These two episodes are essentially saying, work in a team and take things slowly. They're very dull, basic plotlines, where seeing Thomas learn his lesson for the 537th time isn't very entertaining. Of the two, Thomas Gets It Right is a bit more passable, but neither are particularly stunning. And while our next episode, As Good as Gordon, isn't stunning either, it's an improvement. This is certainly quite a good Emily episode, and although it does mess up the express route somewhat, the scenery is very well made. I've always felt that the hit era did the autumn episodes, or fall episodes if you live in the States, rather well. As Good as Gordon was the series' 200th episode, and it was a pretty decent one. The episode Fish is rather interesting. They brought back Arthur for this, who was certainly an interesting choice. The episode wasn't remotely a Three Strikes one, and the crash was great as well, other than the tone shift after it. Seeing Thomas learn his lesson is getting old by now, but I can somewhat see past that because of those other factors here. I also felt that a lot of the shots and camera movements in this episode were really quite creative. Emily's adventure is our next stop, and this might be the worst episode of the season. I do like Emily's flaws in the hit era, but here they just took it too far. That saying please and thank you is something she needs to take a deep breath for just isn't what Emily's about. What annoys me even more is that this episode's title is so freaking misleading. Emily goes on no kind of adventure whatsoever in the episode, don't kid yourself. It's like calling the episode The Flying Kipper, Henry's Accident-Free Chicken Train. Why? Gosh, I hate this episode. It's at this point you begin to see why people look down on Season 8 as the first bad season of Thomas. After 4 mediocre to downright bad episodes, it seems like the hate is deserved. Well, newsflash, it isn't. The following 3 episodes more than make up for any problems. Let's start with Halloween. Halloween is one of the best episodes in Season 8. In a poll done by Soda Island Forums in 2014, this episode placed as the fan favourite of the season, and for good reason. This isn't a spooky episode per se, because we know what's going on the whole time, but you can't deny this episode is fun. Ari and Bert's inclusion worked fairly well, and the atmosphere of the smelter's yard is just out of this world. Even if the episode plotline isn't spooky, the visuals certainly are. I remember that the shadow of the grabber on the wall terrified me as a kid. Halloween is one of the best episodes of the season, hands down. You Can Do It, Toby follows it, and this is another good episode. Sure, Toby is depicted as somewhat frail and scared at the beginning, but to be honest, I'd say that's fair enough at this point. Over the previous seasons, Toby's been through some serious stuff. He's almost died numerous times, had his railway closed down, and it's more in his character to worry than, say, Edward. To me, that isn't what matters though. You Can Do It, Toby is great because it shows Toby's true character, his undaunted spirit, that he will go to great lengths to help any engine, even one who's rude to him. Donald and Douglas also got a name drop, and the episode gives a reason as to why Toby's in charge of Wellsworth Yard, so there's a bit of realism there too. But things get even better than that. James Goes Too Far is next. James Goes Too Far is a weird episode. It's three strikes formula, doesn't do anything particularly novel. By all rules and conventional logic, I should hate this one. That said, it's a great watch. Instead of showing James putting himself first and then getting his comeuppance, they show that he's hardworking, just misguided. It's the job that James is putting before his friends, and this was one of the few times that the show acknowledged that sometimes being really useful isn't the most important thing. There's also a guaranteed connection reference here, so big fan service points. Chicken to School is a story that you shouldn't take seriously. If you do, you'll hate it. It's stupid, but some episodes are designed to be stupid. Of course, it's very unrealistic, and I can't say it's even a masterpiece in humour, but it's an episode that doesn't do anything awful, and is kind of fun. Passable. Too Hot for Thomas is another episode I have huge nostalgia for, but unlike the other ones, it isn't too great. A boring and unrealistic Three Strikes episode with a gimmicky location, that being the ice cream factory, there isn't much to enjoy here. The last episode of the season, however, Percy and the Magic Carpet, is, by contrast, very interesting. Let's get this straight before I begin praising this episode. It's obvious that it's not great in the writing department. The concept is just straight up weird, and it isn't even executed very well. That being said, the technical aspects of this episode are simply insane. The fact that they managed to create a textured model of the flying carpet and didn't have to use CGI at all for this is really impressive, particularly for 2004. Again, the awesome scenery and the practical effects work well. They also brought Murdoch back in for a minor role in this one, which was a move that I was not expecting. On the whole, this episode is decent for its technical aspects, but I still hold that the writing sucks, and the story is unrealistic and a bit weird. Well, we've covered every episode of Season 8, and again I'd like to ask you, has it seemed like a bad season? Like the beginning of some tragic downfall for Thomas that is utterly terrible? With one awful episode and a few poor ones at the beginning and end, most of the episodes here are either simply okay or downright great. So now that we have that covered, let's take a look at a part of this defense which I think is rather unique. And of course, I'm talking about the part where I look at the genuine problems I recognise with this season. Even in a defense video, I think it's very important to recognise the other side of the argument, and see what there is to agree with in it. So, let's look at 4 of my main problems with Season 8. Let's begin by talking about a problem I have with all the Hit era seasons, the new intro to each episode. I don't mind the new theme song, I prefer the original of course, but I don't think the engine roll call is too bad. The thing that bugs me more is the other segment of the intro, where the narrator introduces the island of Sodor. The music for this section is beautiful, but the narration itself is pretty cheesy, the description of the island of Sodor being gimmicky in the extreme. It essentially goes something like this. The island of Sodor is paradise on earth. We feel the need to set this up for you, in case you're one of the 0 people watching who don't understand what an island is. Sodor is made out to be just plain idyllic, and not really industrial at all, other than a passing mention of a coal mine. The intro is the same for all the Hit seasons, and it really isn't my thing. Another problem I have with all of these seasons, but Season 8 to the greatest extent, is the poor titles. So many titles this season, and in the ones following, are very uncreative. They're either character and the object titles, like Thomas and the Tuba, or they're character something object titles, like Percy's New Whistle, or Emily's New Route, and when they aren't formulaic titles, they're generally bad. We already looked at how Emily's Adventure is a very misleading title, and this extends to some other episodes of the season as well. James Gets a New Coat is long-winded, and would have been so much better as James Learns a Lesson, or Trucks in Trouble. The only episode titles I felt were actually good in Season 8 were Squeak, Rattle and Roll, Halloween, and As Good as Gordon. Titles were not this season's strong suit. Those 2 problems, however, pale in comparison to the 2 biggest flaws of the season. One of these flaws is technical, the other is a big problem with the writing. Let's tackle the technical one first. The scenery. The scenery in Season 8 is some of the worst in the show. It's worth noting that, before I get into my full-on rant, the scenery in Halloween is completely exempt from any criticism about to follow. That being said, one good episode doesn't make up for a season filled with incredibly boring sets. Season 8 sets can be summed up in 2 colours, green and grey. Grey ballast and green foliage beside the tracks. 90% of the sets follow that simple formula, and it really makes locations indistinguishable from each other, except for obvious instances such as Gordon's Hill or the fishing village. I've said this before, but Sodor's geography worked the best when each location was very obviously unique in its colour and its layout. Here, that just isn't present. Season 8 feels somewhat plastic, if you know what I mean. It feels like a toy railway, with model trains, rather than a real island off the coast of England with real, heavy machines. This was somewhat fixed in Season 9 with some stunning model work, but here it's still a big problem. Even though the scenery is a massive problem, my main gripe with Season 8 is the fourth and final one I want to address. This is what really drags the season down in my opinion. There's too much Thomas. In the seasons before, Thomas was certainly the main character, and he had a big presence in each season. I don't have a problem with that, and if you do, that's not okay. But here, Season 8, he's just stuffed in too much. Of the 26 episodes in the season, he speaks in a whopping 23 and appears in 25. Squeak, Rattle and Roll is the only episode we never see him in. As much as I dislike people criticising episodes simply because Thomas appears too much, here it's simply overkill. Of the 5 episodes this season that I class as at least poor, Thomas is responsible for 3 of them. That's over half. People also say Emily appeared too much in this season, but I have to disagree there. In contrast to Thomas, she only speaks in 8 episodes, which is way more bearable than how much they overused Thomas. If they'd spent the time they did with Thomas on other characters, maybe secondaries like Salty or Elizabeth, then I would certainly consider this a fantastic, almost classic level season. Sadly, the marketing went and dragged it down here. However, this is a defense video. I have my gripes with Season 8, and although there are certain aspects of it I don't enjoy, on the whole, I say it's a good season. Outside of the first 7 seasons, it's one of the best, along with Season 9 and the Brent era. There are so many things I love about this season. Before I begin harping on about those though, I feel the need to debunk a myth that's been going around in the fandom for a while. People say, get this, that Season 8 reduced the cast of Thomas by a lot. And it's just not true. People seem to think that half the characters in the show disappeared or something as soon as we hit Season 8. This is complete and utter nonsense. If someone tells you this, do not believe them. The only recurring characters from Seasons 1 through 7 we didn't see here were the Skarloey Railway Gang, who would return next season, Fergus, who couldn't appear due to a damaged prop, and the Little Westerners, who would mostly reappear later too. Bill and Ben were absent, but they'd appear consistently later as well. That's a very small portion of the cast, even counting the Skarloey engines. Even the other Season 6 and 7 characters all get at least a sizable cameo. Harvey appears a fair bit here, Elizabeth as well, Salty too. They gave hecking Murdoch and Arthur roles, not to mention Spencer, and yet people still talk like they axed everyone except the Steam team. Even with the few characters they did drop, temporarily I might add, it was Hit's first season in charge. You can't expect them to know how to fit everyone possible inside 26 episodes and write for them flawlessly. Cast reduction is a stupid myth, nothing more. But let's get on to the really good stuff, the reasons I love this season. The first thing I want to tackle is that the 3 strikes formula wasn't actually too present this season. Less than a third of the stories use it in some way, and even when they do, it can actually work quite well. In the majority of cases, the 3 strikes formula episodes here are pretty good. James Goes Too Far is a very obvious example of this. It works nicely with what James is about, and the lessons he still needs to learn. And as much as I don't particularly love Thomas and the Tuba, the 3 strikes concept there was at least a fun one, even if the episode didn't execute it too well. Emily is, to me, one of the best aspects of this season. Even though I hate Emily's adventure, overall I felt she was managed really well, and was in some ways the MVP of this season. After many supporting appearances in Season 7, we see her integrated into the main cast this season. Emily was added to the Steam team nicely. We see her gradually become part of the core cast from Season 7 through to Calling All Engines, which I'm not covering in this video by the way. I massively prefer Season 8 Emily over Season 7 Emily because she has actual flaws and conflict. By this point, Thomas has already been somewhat dumbed down and left without an interesting moral compass, but Emily's flaws really add to her character here and make her a standout in the season. The music in this season is the first time that us Brits ever heard Hartshorn's compositions, and while they're no classic tunes, the hit era themes are pretty decent for what they are. Again, Emily takes the crown here, with a really beautiful theme that has to be one of my favourites in the whole series. Hit era music is making a bit of a comeback on YouTube and SoundCloud right now, and I'm happy for that. Yes, there's lots of brass, but each of the main themes are well developed with a fair few variations. The songs this season, if anything, are an improvement on those of Season 7. Surprises, determination, and Ode to Gordon are all very catchy. Particularly if you're listening to the Headmaster Hastings versions, of course. The engine roll call, while overused a bit, is decent, and while I don't see the thought process behind changing the original theme, I'm not annoyed about it, like I said before. Coming up on 5,000 words in this script, I feel it's time I talk about just how darn strong the character dynamics in this season are. So many interactions are played out this season that ooze with potential, and for the most part, they pull it off. I'm particularly thinking of Percy and Gordon in Gordon Takes Charge. That episode is so good. However, there are also more obscure ones that are quite interesting to note. Thomas and Arthur, picked up from Season 7, James and Salty, Emily and Elizabeth, Gordon and Diesel. When you think about it, these are all dynamics that should have been done long before Season 8 in an ideal world. Most of the time, the characters were very consistent, and the dynamics they had with others was the perfect way of showcasing this. Another thing I love about Season 8 is how dark it is. I would go as far as to say that this is perhaps the only non-classic series I could call dark. One visual in particular comes to mind. In Thomas to the Rescue, Thomas wonders aloud if him and all his friends will be scrapped, and we get a haunting zoom in on a pile of scrapped steam engines. This is one of the few times in the series we are presented with the idea that our core cast are mortal. This theme makes the episode feel very high stakes, as opposed to Steam Team to the Rescue, which has a similar plot but doesn't feel remotely consequential in the grand scheme of things. This darker tone isn't just present in that episode, however. In Percy's Big Mistake, Percy's fear of being killed is at the centre of the episode. Something similar happens in Squeak, Rattle and Roll, where Gordon is confronted by both Diesel and his age in an almost Railway Series style story. Overall in Season 8, there's just a lot of good episodes. It simply shouldn't be classed as a bad, poor, or even mediocre season because there simply aren't enough bad, poor, or even mediocre episodes to justify that. The only bad episode is Emily's Adventure. There are meh ones, of course, but there are in pretty much any season. Even Season 5 had a couple, Season 2 as well. Season 8 is my second favourite hit era season, behind Season 9, and that's because the episodes are just very good. While all this analysis is great, at the end of the day it's the quality of the episodes that really counts. Season 8 does have flaws, but problems like the intro or the scenery don't impact the writing too much. So for this season at least, that's the core of my argument. It isn't a bad season simply because it doesn't have many bad episodes. With the other seasons, as I'm sure you can tell, my thought process will be a little different. But for now at least, this was still a solidly good season and not part of the Dark Ages in any way. So, that's Season 8 covered. For most people, 8 is the most tolerable of the hit seasons, but for me, it isn't actually my favourite. No, my favourite hit era season is actually the season that follows it, that being Season 9 of course. Season 9, unlike Season 8, actually has quite a few episodes that are terrible. Like, really, really, really bad. So why the heck do I like this season if that's the case? Well, there are also some episodes here which I hold on the same level as Season 6, or even Season 1. Let's go. Unlike Season 8, Season 9's first episode is straight away a very good one. In my old defense video, I don't think I got across just how great Percy and the Oil Painting truly is. Now, at first glance, this episode doesn't seem very unique. It's a Three Strikes Formula episode, one of a fair few this season, but actually, that helps it. Although the plot isn't awe-inspiring or a masterclass in storytelling, Percy's character is at its best in this episode. Yes, its best. As much as the episode itself is merely okay, Percy's characterization here is my favourite Percy. Ever. Yes, better than Season 1, better than Season 5. I love Percy here. He's perfectly balanced here. He's patient with the artist at first, but is also fiercely loyal to Sodor, and eventually, when he gets frustrated, he snaps. The episode's ending doesn't even feel like forced wholesomeness. Percy really is the spirit of Sodor. This episode could have done without the boring narration in both dubs, but it's a leisurely story that takes its time, and it gets Percy's character spot on for me. Thomas and the Rainbow is the next episode, and frankly it's pretty mediocre. Unlike the previous episode, this one does feel like the wholesomeness at the end is pretty forced, and as opposed to being relaxed, it takes it a bit too far and just becomes boring. This episode doesn't commit any major crimes against the franchise, but even the crash feels very lightweight. You can tell Thomas is a small model prop here. When most people think of stereotypical hit era episode, this is the kind of thing they think of, and that's a shame. Thomas's milkshake muddle is not much better. Again, 3 strikes, boring, not much to the plot, no real character development, gimmicky location. Off the bat, I can see why people dislike this season. Once again, although the first episode was good, overall this season didn't have a great start. Thomas's milkshake muddle is a very run-of-the-mill episode. Again, not terrible. It's not a Miller-era quality story, it doesn't ruin anything. It just didn't need to be there. I think this era would have benefited massively from shorter seasons, maybe only 18 or 20 episodes. But when you begin to think that this season can't possibly be a good one after a botched start, here we get the next 3 episodes, and they blow pretty much everything out of the water. Mighty Mac is first up, and this is an episode that is very much worth a rewatch. Mighty Mac is such a good concept. The team evidently did their research, and Mighty Mac's basis and real-life history are very much present in the story. Thomas is forced in a little bit, but that's such a tiny nitpick it almost feels wrong to mention it. The scenery and model work is top-notch, as opposed to Season 8, but more importantly, this episode reintroduced the Skarloey Railway. This was the first time we'd seen the railway since Season 7, and many of the set issues from Season 7 on the Skarloey were fixed here. Reintroducing the railway through the eyes of a new character was a good move, and although the hit era typically didn't write too well for the narrow gauge characters, Mighty Mac is certainly one of the exceptions. Molly's Special is an episode that I always felt was a bit overrated. However, I actually really like this one on a rewatch, but not for the reason you think. Most people harp on about this episode because of Molly, and don't get me wrong, Molly had potential. There's an interesting design and places they could go with that character. But no, the main reason I love this episode is how Molly is used to develop several other characters we know already. She brings out a new side of Thomas. His trick to make the other engines impressed with her feels like a very classic Thomas thing to do, playing a deceiving trick for the right reason. Molly also brings out a new side of Emily, and I think there would have been interesting potential there for a rivalry in later seasons. We also see more into the psyches of Gordon, Percy and James here, with how they react to Molly's presence on the island and the trick that Thomas plays. I also really like the way that this episode tells its moral. It's a refreshing change to see a new character make the mistake of not being themselves instead of Thomas. Normally, the new characters are the ones with the flaws. Thomas's leadership role here was very fitting, and it showed a certain level of development and maturity. Not quite as good as Mighty Mac, but this episode is still a strong one. And then, we have respect for Gordon. The Unlucky Tug got to this topic before me, so I'd recommend checking out his video on this episode once you're done here. That said, I'll still go over the many reasons this episode rocks. First, the crash is a very epic one, the best of the season beyond doubt. But more importantly, this episode does wonders for Gordon's character and his dynamic with the other members of the Steam team. Much like Thomas, Emily and the Snowplow, this episode shows us 2 sides, which are both equally flawed, and yet which both have a justifiable reason for what they do. Respect for Gordon reveals Gordon's vulnerable side, tapping into a new side of his personality we simply don't see very often. This episode is generally a great one. I refer you again to Tug's video on it, where he focuses on it a little more in depth. Those 3 episodes were all incredibly strong, 3 of the best in the season for sure. At this point in the season, does it seem like a bad one? 6 episodes so far, and 4 are great, with 2 being mediocre. If we look at the first 6 episodes of Season 6, we see the same results. Interesting. Now, as good as this season is looking so far, the next 2 episodes are both pretty bad. Thomas and the Birthday Picnic was Sharon Miller's first contribution to the series, and the next episode, Tuneful Toots, was also written by her. Genuinely, if you cut the Sharon Miller episodes out of Season 9, it is so much better. Whereas Birthday Picnic is mediocre, Tuneful Toots is the first terrible episode. Well, okay, that's maybe not quite fair. The model work and the lighting near the end is pretty decent, but that can't save the butchering of Rusty's character for me. He's so irresponsible that it's downright sad. Our next episode is Thomas and the Toy Shop, and I like this one. I don't love it, it isn't the best of the season, but it's a charming story that plays with some interesting dynamics. First of all, the episode's atmosphere is on point. Despite the toy workshop being somewhat gimmicky, the episode uses Thomas's interactions with the other characters to outweigh that gimmickiness. If you ask me, we don't see enough of Thomas and Henry's dynamic in the show, so for it to be present here is really nice. The ending, again, is not forced, it almost has Thomas and the Missing Christmas Tree vibes to it. Side note, they actually included a Railway Series illustration from Tank Engine Thomas again in the shop. A nice touch for sure. Rheneas and the Dinosaur is another terrible episode. Don't worry guys, I swear it gets better. Season 9's chief flaw was the way it handled Skarloey, Rheneas, and Rusty. We'll be talking a lot about that when we reach the problems I have with this season. This episode does suck, and I'm not going to try and tell you otherwise. However, I do think it has a couple of slightly redeeming elements. First off, the dinosaur skeleton is a pretty cool prop, despite the lack of realism with it just standing out there on the flatbed. Secondly, the model work is once again quite nice. I don't defend this episode though, so let's move on to the next one, which I really do defend. Thomas and the New Engine is an episode which is hated by most people in the fandom, and I have no clue why. Well, maybe I do, but I don't agree with it. Typically, this episode is criticised for two reasons. First of all, people think Thomas is a jerk. Secondly, people say Neville is a boring character. Let's deal with Thomas first, he's much easier. People who say Thomas is incredibly mean here have obviously never watched the episode. They always say, Thomas spread rumours about Neville, when that just isn't the point. Thomas reported the story as he saw it, admittedly a little off, and then it was his friends who blew it out of proportion, one by one, leading to the shenanigans in the episode. First off, that's a strong moral. Secondly, it wasn't Thomas's fault. And even if it was, he was a terrible jerk in the Railway series, and people praise it there. But when it's an episode disliked by general consensus, no, now we have to change our views. The criticism of Thomas here is ridiculous. As for Neville, I can understand that one a little bit better. Neville is quite bland in this episode, but my response to that is that this episode isn't about him. It's about Thomas and the others, what their instinctual reactions are. Thomas is the main character here, and he's supposed to be, not Neville. I count Neville being bland as a fault of seasons 10 and 11, rather than season 9, because it was their job to expand on the characters after his debut. But they chose not to. We'll be talking about character expansion in the flaws section as well. Toby Feels Left Out is quite uncreative and not my favourite episode. Toby here is out of character, it's not very interesting, and the title is laughable. Not much more to say. Thomas Tries His Best seems like just another hit episode with Thomas learning a generic lesson, but I actually quite like it. Not so much for the writing, but for the time progression. This is an episode where you actually feel the movement of time, the hours sliding past. In addition, the scenes inside Thomas's head were quite a unique way of showing his worries, and something that the series didn't do very often until this point. So although I don't love this episode, I don't think it's bad either. Anyway, let's talk about the Magic Lamp, one of my favourite episodes of this season, and perhaps one of my favourite ever. The Magic Lamp is fantastic. Yes, I know it's a 3 Strikes formula episode, but I also don't care. This episode is the best 3 Strikes one in the history of the show, and Sharon Miller's best contribution by far. Let's go over the 4 reasons I love the Magic Lamp. First of all is Peter Sam, the main character of the story. Peter Sam didn't get much time to shine in the Hit era, and it was fairly obvious from the outset that Hit weren't as interested in him as Skarloey, Duncan, or Rusty. But this is an episode where he's given the lead role, and to be honest, I think it works really well. Peter Sam being cynical of legend is an interesting new character trait, and I think he works in the role perfectly. Second is Proteus. I love how he's presented. We only see like 5 seconds of him, but I think that was intentional. He's kept incredibly mysterious, and I really like that they don't actually tell the audience whether the legends are true or not. Thirdly, Skarloey is perfectly in character here, for one of the few times in this era. Skarloey's legend, while not particularly long in comparison to the rest of the episode, has a real stories around a campfire feeling, which the lighting really contributes to, I think. And that leads me into arguably the best thing about the Magic Lamp, the atmosphere, the model work, the fog effects, the lighting. In terms of technical work, this is one of the best episodes of the show ever made. The mountains feel really mysterious and eerie, and I actually think each of the 3 strikes contributes to the tone in some way. They're all very different, which certainly helps. Certainly Miller's best episode, The Magic Lamp, is great. The next episode is probably just as good. Thomas and the Statue is in my top 5 favourite Hit episodes ever, easily. This episode is a fantastic character building one. Thomas thinks this cool new statue is of him, and his friends get super mad at him for being so cocky, when he hasn't even seen the statue. This episode is a wonderful example of the 2 flawed protagonists idea, a concept that this season seemed to enjoy playing around with. Both Thomas and his friends are flawed here, but both are right in different ways. The STEAM team overreacted a bit to Thomas's thoughts, but he admittedly shouldn't have been so arrogant and presumptuous in the first place. This episode does Thomas perfectly. He's very much in classic personality here, and his redemption at the end is heartwarming. The same can be said of the last scene where the STEAM team see the statues of all of them together. This episode is both very accurate to the classics and also very wholesome. I like Season 9 because of episodes like this. Henry and the Flagpole was an episode that I adored as a kid. At the time, it was probably my favourite episode of all the seasons I'd seen. Now, I still quite like it. Again, it has a Three Strikes formula element to it, but it's a nice, simple story that ties Henry's love for nature very closely to the main plot. Also, we see Trevor here. That was a really nice detail, as was Toby and Henry's brief dynamic here, something we see more of next season. And the music at the beginning slaps too, bagpipes for the win. The music throughout the episode is some of the best in the season. Sure, having the flagpole on an open flatbed was silly, but sometimes unrealistic scenarios are needed for good stories. The scene with Salty at the start is also a bit dumb, but this episode is still an okay one in my books. Emily Knows Best is a strange kind of episode. On the one hand, the concept is gimmicky. I don't particularly like Emily here. Generally, it's just quite childish. But it has this shot. This is the best meme template ever, so I'm going to give it a point just for that. It also has a quite nice Toby moment, so small bonus point for that as well. Other than that, I don't really see much to like here. Not a terrible episode that screws over the season, just a kind of meh one that isn't popular for a reason. Another Sharon Miller contribution that didn't entirely suck is our next episode, Thomas's Day Off. This is another strong one. Dennis is kind of a hit-era daisy, but I like his unique design. And I do mean unique, only one of his bases was ever actually made in real life. Thomas here feels very Thomas. He's initially helpful, but feels betrayed and hurt when it turns out Dennis has been using him for his own ends. The idea of engines having days off is kinda stupid, but no more than Henry going to a beautiful forest in his so-called spare time. And everyone loves that episode. I'd say the main strength of this episode is that it's really quite relatable. I've known a couple of Dennises myself, and I think the moral is strong. Dennis didn't need a redemption at the end, in my opinion, but on the whole, I think this episode is still alright. I was really quite surprised at how much I enjoyed Thomas's new trucks on a rewatch. The concept is simultaneously kinda silly, but also really well delivered. The music in this episode is good, the model work is nicely varied, and Bill and Ben are back. The thing I really love though is Thomas and James's dynamic. Their rivalry was handled very well in this era as a whole, and this episode is the perfect case study. These two are so much fun to watch together. The crash here is also very creative. We'll be talking more about that soon. Next up we have a personal favourite of mine, Duncan and the Old Mine. This episode stands out for one thing, model work. The model work here is superb, and we see the mountain road again. Duncan was done really well here. He's clearly grown from season 4, but still has that foolish edge to his personality. It was nice to see Rusty very much in character as well here, worried for Duncan's safety, and not always keeping a cool head despite being kind. This episode isn't actually one I can talk about at length, I just really enjoy how different it is. There's no hint of a Three Strikes formula here, it breaks the mold and goes in a different direction. Bold and Brave is, yet again, a good episode. There's so much to enjoy in this season, and this is why I prefer it to Season 8. Season 8 had some good ones, and some poor ones. Season 9, on the other hand, takes those two quality levels and amplifies them, excellent or terrible. Let's talk a bit about Bold and Brave. This episode seems generic, but I do like it. Diesel here is kind of a weak character, but it was nice to see Bill and Ben again. I also really love some of the set pieces here. The cliffs are evidently inspired by the kind of rock they were using back in Season 7, and the mist effects are really well done too. In terms of plot, this is a kind of a nothing episode, but for me it was a good one on the technical side of things. The Curse of the Cliffs is a neat concept too, and we're never actually told if there's any truth to it. Skarloey the Brave is the worst episode of the season, without a shadow of a doubt. Skarloey here is so badly written, it's genuinely quite hard to believe the writers ever watched him in anything pre-season 7. Skarloey as a daredevil is a terrible idea, I hate it even more than him being a wimp. Let's get past this one quickly. I like Saving Edward. Please, don't shoot. Saving Edward is actually decent. The only problem with it is that they used Edward as the main character. Swap him out for nearly anyone else, and this episode would be fantastic. Although Edward is presented as weak and frail here, the actual idea for the plot is a really good one. Thomas's dynamic with Edward is also really nice to see. We don't see that much of them together. So, although I don't like Edward being the main character, The structure of the plot is sound, and I like the concept of a lie being told for the right reasons. That's an interesting moral situation, and then the characters struggling with the implications of it. Thomas and the Golden Eagle is mediocre. Generic? Yes. Bland? Yes. Not absolutely terrible? Yes. Just very lackluster? Yes. I literally cannot say anything more. Keeping Up with James is another episode which works wonders for the season. It's very Old Iron-esque in a way. The crash is very good, and James and Edward is a good dynamic here. It's not an episode that does anything novel, but it showcases some of James's typical arrogance, which is never bad to see. The finale of the season, Flower Power, is also great. This is essentially a hit-era ghost train, and it works incredibly well. It's a really fun story, Thomas and Diesel mucking around when there's work to be done. The lighting and set design is a real plus, the fog effects look great too. This episode isn't meaningful, it doesn't show development like Respect for Gordon or Thomas and the Statue, but what it does do is promise a fun story and deliver on it. Flower Power is a strong finish to a strong season. I hope you can see why I love this season. Sure, it has duds, 3 or 4 really bad episodes at least, but it also has so much to offer. Percy and the Old Painting, Mighty Mac, Molly's Special, Respect for Gordon, Thomas and the New Engine, The Magic Lamp, Thomas and the Statue, Duncan and the Old Mine, Flower Power. There are more I could name. This season is a better season than Series 8 because it introduced new characters, all of whom had at least something to them, unlike in Season 10, which we'll talk about soon. There are many more great things about this season, but we'll save those for the defense section. For now, let's look at some of the flaws of this season. Just like with Season 8, I've narrowed down Season 9's main flaws to just a few. The first is perhaps the most obvious, Skarloey and Rhaenys. Despite defending this season on the whole, I certainly don't defend how it wrote these two. Them being babies and worse, daredevils, is just terrible. The Magic Lamp was fine in how it did Skarloey, but both these characters have at least one episode where their horrible childishness is put on full display. For Skarloey, it's Skarloey the Brave, and for Rhaenys, it's Rhaenys and the Dinosaur. Both suck. A lot. Rusty also somewhat gets this treatment in Tuneful Toots, but for me he's completely redeemed by Duncan and the Old Mine, which I think gets him absolutely perfect. Skarloey and Rhaenys are the biggest fault of this season, but since they only affect 2 or 3 episodes, all of which are very skippable, they don't make the entire season a bad one. Secondly, a problem I had with the new characters was that they weren't really expanded on at all. They all had decent debut episodes, particularly Mighty Mac, but after those episodes, this era didn't really do much with them. As I said before, that is partly Seasons 10 and 11's fault, but the problem started in Season 9. We get a little bit of Mighty Mac in later seasons, but the other 3 are almost completely forgotten. On the topic of new characters, I also don't like how Thomas was used in all the newbie episodes. I get he's the main character, but every time a newbie shows up, he doesn't have to be the co-star of their first appearance. For example, imagine how cool Molly's Special would have been if they'd paired her up with Emily in a rivalry story. Or imagine how neat it would have been if Dennis had first appeared alongside James, and the dynamic that would make. But no, it's Thomas. The final problem I have with this season is Sharon Miller. Don't get me wrong, I think her writing is far worse than the following seasons, and I actually like The Magic Lamp and Thomas's Day Off to an extent, but her other offerings are both very poor. Thomas and the Birthday Picnic was very unremarkable, and Tuneful Toots made Rusty completely different to how he acts in established canon. Sharon Miller's influence began here, and she's the person I blame for making the public perceive Thomas as a dumb kids show. She wasn't the only factor, of course, and I have nothing against her as a person, but this was the beginning of her spiralling the franchise into its first dark age. So those are the flaws of Season 9. Despite it having worse duds than Season 8, I think as a whole, there's less wrong with it, because the successes of the season are so high, and fairly common too. Let's talk a bit more about why this is my favourite of the 4 seasons I'm defending in this video. Let's defend Season 9. One of the main reasons I love Season 9 is that there was a very clear effort to push beyond the boundaries of Season 8. Let me explain. Season 8 hadn't introduced any new characters, we hadn't seen the Skarloey Railway, and there had been a lot of boring sets used. Season 9 fixes all of those problems, at least to some degree. Season 9 has a very expansive cast, and we see some returnees too. Each episode, except for maybe 2 or 3, feels very different from the ones around it. The main area this season did way better than Season 8 was model work. Seriously, there are some really funky sets used this season and some really funky lighting. They largely scrapped the fisheye kind of lenses they'd used occasionally in the previous season, and there were way more experimental camera movements too. The sets were also really interesting. Shen Valley looks fantastic, it's a pity we didn't see it more. The Skarloey Causeway was also remade for this season, and it looks great. The Skarloey Railway in general looks way better than Season 7, and it just gets better with sets like the Skarloey Forest in Season 11. Kuldee Caves is also a standout location, as are the high hills in the Magic Lamp and the cliffs in Bold and Brave. The standout episode in terms of set design is definitely Flower Power. Both the abandoned mines and the Sodor Flower Mill yard look really cool. The lighting in this season is also way better than the previous. There's a lot more that takes place at evening and at night, and the fog effects work really well in the spooky episodes. There are many things that make Season 9 a good season in my eyes, but before we get on to the next big one, I'm going to go over 3 small things I really appreciated here. First of all, the introduction of the Thin Controller. While hardly even a new character, he was a welcome addition, as I never liked the Fat Controller managing the Skarloey Railway in the classic series. The Thin Controller has a good design, and he becomes a mainstay of the series from this point on. Secondly, the songs this season are, like those of Season 8, very good. I don't really care for Party Time or Buffer Up and Share, but the others all range from decent to absolute bangers. Brave in particular is a really good one. It's incredibly repetitive, and has a really cool beat. Day and Night has some really cool atmospheric shots, and Pride is pretty good as well. Togetherness is also kind of about Edward and Henry, 2 characters who don't really have songs of their own. Thirdly, the music in general. The music in this season is another big step up from the previous season, and a lot more creative themes are used. A great example of this is the Scottish bagpipe / accordion music at the beginning of Henry and the Flagpole. This season had variety in its music, and I really appreciate that. The next big thing that Season 9 did really well was action. The crashes in this season rival those of the classics. Of course, the most memorable is Respect for Gordon, but there are so many other great examples of neat choreography which are almost as good. Mighty Mac has a cool landslide, and Dennis's crash in Thomas's Day Off isn't half bad either. But it gets better than that. Neville's bridge crash was actually based on a real incident, very classic series-esque there. It also had tension on its side. Keeping Up with James and Thomas's new trucks also brings some really unique contributions to the table. Even episodes without crashes in them felt way more active and adventure-y than those from Season 8. See Duncan and the Old Mine, The Magic Lamp, and Flower Power. This contributed to the feeling of the season being more about action than reaction. Season 8 was often things happening and the characters responding, whereas Season 9 was the characters acting and making things happen as a result. A subtle difference, but an important one. The core of my argument, which defends Season 9, is a little different from my Season 8 one. There is bad stuff in Season 9, and out of character moments, and lackluster writing. But in my opinion, the successes of this season are much better than the successes of Season 8 or any other hit season. It has some problems, but the highs are real highs, almost reaching on Season 3 and 4 quality, dare I say it. There's also a lot of variety. There are some character-driven episodes, Respect for Gordon, Thomas and the Statue, and some great technical episodes, Duncan and the Old Mine, Flower Power. The best episodes of Season 8 were really good, but for me they don't come close to matching the best of Season 9. Season 9 is a solidly decent season, and I will die on that hill. Ah yes, Season 10. Season 10 has actually gone up in my opinion since I last watched it. There are some really good episodes here. I view this season as a slightly downgraded Season 9. It has some great episodes and some terrible ones. Let's talk about each one in turn. Follow That Flower is objectively a poor episode, but I can look past that because it's a fun one. This episode is just Thomas and James screwing around on Sodor, episode 113, and I really like that. I'm going to talk a lot about this later, but Season 10 really was all about character dynamic. Thomas and James was a great one this season. It's present in some later episodes as well. Follow That Flower also has one of the best opening shots of any episode ever. That shot of Rusty going across Skarloey Railway Bridge number 723 with Skarloey Railway Bridge 1726 in the foreground is really great. Also, I find the way the truck's faces just disappear a bit into the episode funny. Of course that was unintentional, but it's kinda goofy. So this is a fun episode. Not objectively good, but fun. A Smooth Ride is fantastic. They brought Sir Handel back, with a reason for his return, with character development. That is so cool. Not only the fact that they thought to include him again, but the fact that they went out of their way to explain where he'd been. Really, really cool. Even Daisy in Sodor's Legend of the Lost Freaking Treasure didn't get that. Big Mickey in Season 21, he didn't get that. Jack, Bill and Ben, Terence, Diesel 10, didn't think so. Well, Sir Handel did. Other than his return, I actually quite like this episode in general. Mr. Percival in the coach is funny, and I like Peter Sam and Sir Handel interacting. I think there was very intentional reference to the classic series and the Mid-Sodor Railway here. Thomas and the Jet Plane is okay. It's kind of boring. Jeremy is a very lackluster character, but the episode itself is decent. This episode somewhat reminds me of Victor Tanzig's Stories of Sodor episode, Aviation, although that's a lot better. Thomas tries to come to terms here with the fact that he isn't as versatile or high-flying, literally, as Jeremy, but that he can still be useful and complement Jeremy's mode of transport. So I don't like this episode, but I think it had an interesting concept, just poor execution. Percy and the Carnival is another boring episode. Like a few episodes we've covered so far, it isn't terrible, just dull. It's episodes like these that make people think the hit era is all the same format, when it isn't. The most notable thing that this episode does is bring back the Chinese dragon from season 3. Other than that, it gets lost among more exciting episodes this season. The Green Controller is another Percy episode, and although he's maybe a little stupid here, the episode itself is a good one. It has a fun concept, the Three Strikes formula was made for this kind of episode, and we get to see lots of railway shenanigans. As I say, Percy was just a bit too dumb here, and I think Dowager Hap's Busy Day from the Brenner era did this concept better, but this episode walked so that that one could run. The Green Controller is goofy, unrealistic, but self-aware, and doesn't take itself too seriously. A really fun episode. Speaking of really funny episodes, Duncan drops a clanger. The title alone is really funny, given Duncan's history of rock and roll, and the idea is so stupid that it's obvious this episode isn't supposed to be treated seriously. Again, he's dumbed down a bit, but Duncan is entertaining, and you see his classic personality shine through. Duncan is, in my opinion, one of the best written characters in these seasons, and this was the second episode, after Duncan and the Old Mine, that showed him in a spotlight role. Duncan has matured from season 4, but he's still grumpy, silly, and has some maturing to do. Also, this episode is the first since Squeak, Rattle and Roll in season 8 to not feature Thomas. That says a lot about this episode's priorities. It just wanted to be a fun story. And boy, did it manage. Thomas's Tricky Tree is quite a bad episode. Currently, season 10 might not be looking the best to you, but please bear with it, there are some great episodes later on. Thomas's Tricky Tree, other than an amusing sequence at the start where Duncan teases Thomas a bit, is a poor contribution. Generic, bland, it's a run-of-the-mill mid-season episode, nothing special. The title also sucks. Thomas is a jerk, I don't like this one. I find Toby's Afternoon Off to be an unfortunate episode. It has a really, really great moral, and that makes it even more of a shame that Toby was used to illustrate it. If this had been Henry, I think it would have worked a lot better. But since they used Toby, it leads to major out-of-character moments, and sadly, quite a poor episode. This episode came so close to making itself interesting, but didn't quite manage. It's Good to Be Gordon is amazing. This episode is season 1 quality, and it is better than a lot of classic episodes. Sure, this episode retconned Henry needing special coal back into the story, but who cares? This episode is a deep look into what make Gordon and Henry tick. Henry's determination despite having to use ordinary coal is very in character, and Gordon's initial ignorance and then empathy are done beautifully too. There's a particular line I really love here.
But no matter how fast Gordon went, he couldn't get away from the bad feeling in his boiler.
Gordon's thing is that he's fast, but Henry's plight here has such an effect on him that he's willing to help him, even at the cost of his very identity, in a way. This episode is 10 out of 10 for character building, music, and everything else. One of the hit era's greatest. Seeing the Sights is a good episode. I can't actually remember ever watching this episode before, but I like it. It has some great music and features Bertie, who I think is in true classic personality, friendly but often quite impatient. This story feels very similar to Thomas's Train, which isn't a story I love, but certainly a classic one. The main highlight of this episode for me is that it's a Thomas and Gordon rivalry story. We didn't see a whole lot of Thomas and Gordon together in this era, so I think this episode is a nice exception in that regard. This episode is a fun one, and I would definitely recommend it. Fearless Freddy is a flawed episode, but overall, a good one. Let's start with the problems I have with this episode. There are 2 of them, and their names are Skarloey and Rheneas. These 2 are immature here in the extreme. They're essentially young and foolish daredevils, and I really don't like it. And yet, I still like this episode, for 4 reasons. Number 1, model work. It's really good. The High Hills locations are some of my favourite sets this season. The idea of a set of older tracks high up in the mountains, which only the railway's veterans know of, is a really cool one. Secondly, Rheneas' crash. This derailment is really unique, and carries on the idea of every crash being different from season 9. Thirdly, I like the connection which is drawn between Sir Handel and Freddy. heavily implying that Freddy was a mid-Sodor engine at one point, hence why he knows Sir Handel, but not Skarloey and Rhaenys. Fourthly, and most importantly, I love Freddy. This was one of the few times the show really went out of its way to show that older people aren't necessarily wise all the time. Freddy struggles with the fact that he is aging and not what he once was, and his flaws really come out here. He's got a really cool basis, and on the whole, I think he's the best new character introduced in this season. This episode has problems, and they shouldn't be ignored, but I like it on the whole. Toby's new shed is a cute episode. When some birds are made homeless, Toby gives them a new home. This is one of the few episodes in this era that gets Toby pretty much perfect. He's caring and experienced. There isn't much more I can say about this one. I think it's adorable, and not much else. Big Strong Henry is basically the flip side of It's Good to Be Gordon. I really like this one. I don't think it's as good as its counterpart, but it still presents an interesting dynamic. I also really commend the crash in this one. It's short, blunt, snappy, and doesn't offer any bad slow motion. This is a good character building episode, which expands upon Henry, Gordon, Thomas, and Percy. Sticky Toffee Thomas, on the other hand, is pretty stupid. It's a childish episode with a childish main character trying to do childish things. I simply can't rate this episode highly. The ending is forced and Thomas is an idiot throughout. The idea is gimmicky, and overall this episode is just a snorefest. Which Way Now is a generally disliked episode, but I think it's quite good. Rusty was the wrong character to use, but the concept itself is fun, and the three strikes aren't really grating here. The model work here is also very impressive, some of the best sets of the season. A fun episode, and not one I would call bad. Thomas and the Shooting Star, like Which Way Now, has some great model work. This is a really pretty episode. I also like Thomas's different options for wishes here, diesel, fish and snowplows being gone from his life. Very true to character, and those last two tie in nicely with the classic series as well. The ending of this episode is also so sweet. This is one of my favourite endings in the show, period. It's cheesy as heck, but lovely too.
His friends were talking about their wishes. Gordon said he felt grander. James was sure he was redder. Percy was just happy to see his friend. "I wished you would come home safely," he peeped. "Thank you, Percy," tooted Thomas. "Both of our wishes came true."
This episode is a bit gimmicky, but I have no problem looking past that with all the positives I mentioned. Okay, we're here at last. The next 4 episodes are not defendable. I hate all of them, and I also think it's interesting that they're right next to each other, and that the 3 worst ones are all written by Sharon Miller. I want to get through these as quickly as possible. Let's go. Edward Strikes Out sucks. You know why. Rocky has a cool design, and I think he had potential, but Edward here is terrible. Completely out of character, in one of the worst breaches in canon ever. I actually think if James was swapped into Edward's role here, it would be a decent story. There are some really creative shots, and the concept of newfangled nonsense actually sounds somewhat Railway Series-esque. But on the whole, still a terrible episode. Tops Off Thomas, if I can say this, is worse than Edward Strikes Out. Let me play this clip for you real quick.
The wind heard Thomas. The Fat Controller's hat floated gently onto Thomas's funnel.
What? Also, it's rubbish in terms of writing. War and Peace is the only one of these 4 episodes not written by Miller, and for some strange reason, it's the only one I can sit through. Wonder why that might be. It's still terrible though. Skarloey is wimpy and pathetic. The only thing this has going for it are the Worf shots and Skarloey taking the hit for Rhaenys, but even that got the slow motion treatment. Finally, Thomas's frosty friend is so dumb. Strangely enough, the frosty friend in question isn't the problem, it's the Thomas that is the problem. He's so stupid. Let's stop talking about this one, it makes me break out in cold sweat. Get it? Cold sweat, haha, very funny. Now, this might sound surprising, but after this point, I wouldn't say there is a single bad episode in this season. The last 8 episodes of this season are all good, to varying degrees, but all good nonetheless. So while I don't like this season as much as Season 9, I still think it is ridiculously overhated. The first of these solid episodes is Emily and the Special Coaches. Emily and the Special Coaches is fantastic, because it takes both Emily and Diesel and makes a really interesting episode out of them. Now, I have this thing where I really dislike Diesel redemption stories. Even some of the better ones, like Springtime for Diesel, don't really go down too well with me, because redemption isn't what Diesel is about. This is the same reason I hate Thomas and the Evil Diesel from Chris Audrey. Diesel should be like George. George didn't get a redemption arc, and he was much stronger for that. People in real life don't always have 180-degree turns, where they suddenly become lovely. But if I had to choose my favourite Diesel redemption story from across the eras, I would choose Emily and the Special Coaches. I would choose it because, unlike other Diesel redemption arcs, it makes both Diesel and the character he's interacting with incredibly flawed. Emily's fatal flaw, her bossiness and her impatience, come out really nicely here. In this episode, she's no better than Diesel is, and Diesel's no better than her. Contrast that to other Diesel redemption stories, where the one Diesel interacts with, normally Thomas, is made out to be an absolute saint, to throw Diesel's problems into sharper contrast. No More Mr. Nice Engine kind of does this, but not as well as this episode in my opinion. There's also some interesting paralleling between Gordon's themed new blue coaches and Emily's themed green ones from season 7, probably not intentional, but the two stories have similar structures, with Emily's role flipped. There's a lot of moral depth to this episode. I'd recommend rewatching it. Thomas and the Colours is a fun Thomas and James episode. It's not very special, overall it's kind of forgettable if I'm honest, but their dynamic is fun. Some of the shot compositions here are also quite neat. A simple story, but an okay one. Thomas and the Birthday Mail is really good. First of all, the atmospherics here are top notch. The practical effects and the colour grading makes this a very visually different episode from the rest of the hit era. Secondly, Rosie. Rosie is one of the most significant female characters in the show's history, and I feel her introduction here was a good one. She's annoying enough that you can see why Thomas gets cross, but it doesn't go to the extent of Billy, where she's a pain to see. The idea of a new character fangirling over Thomas is really unique, and I think Thomas himself is in full classic character here. Rosie also has a fascinating basis. In general, this episode's really solid. It stands out from the crowd, and in season 10, that's a real positive. Duncan's Bluff, yes please. This episode is the best of the season. It took a dynamic from the Railway series that desperately needed an episode, and made a stellar one. Duncan and James are so much fun together, and the fact we don't really see them together after this makes this episode all the more precious. Duncan's trick, while a little basic, feels very Duncan. In this era of the show, we saw Duncan to be a lot more sly, particularly here and in The Great Discovery. I think it suits him nicely. He's grown up a bit from being angry at everything all the time, but he's still standoffish and will do what he has to achieve his own ends. James, being super pompous, is the perfect match, and when the two here come into contact, the showdown is somewhat explosive. James is in perfect character, and I feel like Michael Angelis was having a bit more fun than normal with this episode. There are some cool shots and sets too. I really like the close-up of James's fire, and also the shot of Duncan going over Skarloey Railway Bridge 961. Missing Trucks is another good episode, one of the few good Skarloey and Rhaenyra ones in this era. The plot is kind of convoluted, and there's an out-of-character moment for Skarloey at the beginning, but I still like this episode because it gives a bit more depth to Rhaenyra's character for me. He does the right thing here, but he doesn't fully think through the knock-on consequences of his good deed. It's a mistake that even a wise engine can make, and as a result, I don't think this is a breach of canon. This episode is fine. It's certainly not one of the season's greats, but it's a solid one. Thomas and the Treasure is a really laid-back episode, and a lot of people think it's gimmicky. And yes, I can see where that viewpoint comes from, and I even agree with it to an extent. But this episode has nice gimmicks, rather than stupid ones. I really enjoy this episode for 3 reasons. Firstly, the model work here, amazing. Just look at those sets, really creative and adventurous stuff here. Secondly, I actually like the clues to the treasure. With the exception of the skull and crossbones, they aren't too childish. And while I was still able to work them out really quickly on a rewatch, the second one in particular, Clouds Not in the Sky, is just ambiguous enough that you might be left guessing. And thirdly, I like a very small detail in this episode that was definitely unintentional: Henry's absence. In this episode, the 3 engines to scoff at Thomas are Gordon, James, and Emily. Emily, rather than Henry, who would be much more traditionally sided with Gordon and James. As I say, I highly doubt that this was done on purpose, but I like to think that the reason Henry wouldn't scoff at Thomas was because he's very superstitious. Henry is the kind of person who believes in the powers of wishing trees and lucky trucks in this era. He'd totally believe in hidden treasure. Just a fun headcanon to go with a fun episode. James the Second Best is absolutely fantastic. James and Edward have perfect dynamic here. This is the only time I can think of when, at the start of an episode, Edward shows everyone up. That doesn't happen anywhere else. He's normally played as the victim. This episode is also really funny, with one of the most inventive crashes in the show ever. I also love this episode's ending. James doesn't get a poster for himself, and he's okay with that. He's okay with it because he realises there's more to being like Edward than being on a poster. The reward is the journey of kindness and responsibility he takes to get there. And it's the journey that matters, rather than the destination. This is a great James episode above all else, and when coupled with the crash and the moral weight of the episode, it tips the scales in Season 10's favour for sure. The last episode of the season, Thomas and Skarloey's Big Day Out, is another good one. I do feel that Thomas and Skarloey weren't necessarily the right characters. I feel like this could have been a better Rosie episode, perhaps with Peter Sam. That said, I like that this episode shows just how large Sodor is. Skarloey is an experienced engine, or at least he's supposed to be most of the time, and yet there's a large swathe of Sodor that he's never been to. I also like his quiet, humble appreciation at the end of the episode. It fits him nicely. And, well, that's Season 10. Unlike with Seasons 8 and 9, there's only one real flaw I can single out with Season 10. But it is a massive one, a huge problem that neither of the seasons before it suffered from to the same extent. And that problem is a disregard for continuity. There are a lot of out-of-character episodes this season, both narrow gauge and standard gauge. Edward Strikes Out is probably the most infamous, but the problem crops up elsewhere too. And again, Sharon Miller's episodes are the worst in this regard. What else can I say? I think Season 10 suffered from this more than 8 and 9, because when it was written, the show was at a point where the classic series had been largely forgotten by the writers. Those writing for Season 8 would have seen Season 7, but not necessarily anything before that. The Season 10 writers, if they were working off the season before, would have seen Skarloey's inconsistency there and taken it to the max here. In this season, Thomas is also pretty silly, more so than in the other hit seasons. It's weird, everybody writes him differently. He has some good episodes this season, Thomas and the Birthday Mail, even episodes like Follow That Flower to an extent, but also has some really, really poor ones. This era struggled with Thomas's consistency. On the whole, he was very solid in Seasons 8 and 9, but I think he dropped off a bit in Seasons 10 and 11. He still had his moments, like we've discussed, but overall he was portrayed as younger and younger each season as the brand tried harder and harder to place him in a relatable spotlight for the target audience. Season 8 and 9 had a few problems each, but all those problems were fairly small, with the exception of Skarloey and Rhaeus in Season 9 perhaps. But Season 10 is the opposite. It has one flaw, but it's a massive one. Sticking to canon is one of the first things I look at a season for. I can appreciate seasons like Season 7 because they didn't break it, more so than very popular media like Hero of the Rails, which screwed it over with Hero's backstory for example. I hold canon as sacred. You can have your own, but the show's canon has to be stuck to in the show. And sadly, Season 10 doesn't do that very well. We've talked about why Season 10 can be classed as poor, but I don't want to come across as disliking this season. I don't. For every terrible episode this season, there is a really, really great one. Much like Season 9, the duds of Season 10 were really bad, but the successes were really, really great. One thing that actually improved from Season 9 to 10 was the writing team's use of character dynamics. There are so many interesting pairings this season. Duncan and James, James and Edward, Emily and Diesel, Thomas and Skarloey, and lots of Henry and Gordon. Old dynamics from previous seasons were also expanded upon, such as the Thomas and James dynamic, which was played to exception in this era. This season shows a lot of characters' flaws and their journey to overcome them, which I really respect. When you compare the interaction and development in this season to a Miller or Webber season, it's just so far ahead. The titles in this season, on the whole, are also way better than those of the previous seasons. It's a minor point, but I think it's quite an important one nonetheless. The model work is still strong here, and while it's no Season 9, we had some good crashes. See Big Strong Henry and James the Second Best. This season had a whole range of weather and moods to work with, and it did a really good job with that. For example, the winter setting of Big Strong Henry doesn't feel contrived and gimmicky like it did with Percy's New Whistle all the way back in Season 8. This is because snow is used just enough to make it wintry, but sparingly too, so that it doesn't look overdone. Thomas and the Birthday Mail is also a standout in this regard. They nailed the tone in everything from the water to the mud in that episode. One thing that I really want to talk about with Season 10 is what I would call interesting moral situations. Now, Thomas was never about the morals in its heyday, but I think this has caused a wrong impression in some fans' minds. Some people seem to think that as soon as an episode has a moral that is even slightly obvious, it becomes a bad, childish episode. And that really annoys me. Sure, morals shouldn't be the point of Thomas. I don't like it when things are needlessly moralistic and trade a good story for a point, see Harvey to the Rescue for a prime example, but at the same time, a good moral can be fitted into a good story really nicely. The moral can show us new sides of our beloved characters, but also of life. I think Season 10 has some really good moral situations, perhaps even exceeding those of the classic seasons. Wherever there was an implicit moral in the classics, it was always quite simple, something like don't judge by appearances, or never give up. Now, as I say, those morals were never stated, but rather implicit in the story. But they were also kind of flat, just teaching one kind of generic lesson. They're good morals, but they suffer from being very mainstream. But Season 10 has some really dynamic morals. Morals which leave you thinking, what was the right thing to do there? You see this in Fearless Freddy, for example, where we are presented with an older engine who should be wise and sage, but is trying to cling on to reputation a bit too much, and has real flaws that kids, and adults if we're honest, have themselves. You see this in Emily and the Special Coaches, where we're presented with Diesel, who rightly wants to be recognised for a real achievement, but goes about the wrong way getting Emily to listen. And on the other side of that coin there's Emily, who's trying to do the right thing and get the coach sorted out, but is overly harsh to Diesel at the same time. That's a fascinating moral complex. Those are the two main examples from this season, but you see similar ideas in Missing Trucks and James the Second Best. This season was a master of morality. Yes, the morals were sometimes a bit overstated and blunt, but they were complex in a way that those of the classic series, and even the books, weren't. My argument in defense of Season 10 isn't that it had great writing throughout, or that it stayed close to canon, because it did neither of those things. But what it did do was pair up some fascinating duos that had never been seen before, have strong model work and a clear passion behind the practical aspect. It also presented some fascinating morals, which were more complex than some from the show's golden age. And that, I think, deserves to be remembered and defended. Season 11 is an interesting season for reasons we'll discuss later. For now though, let's look at each of the episodes, and the first ones are really, really good. Thomas and the Storyteller is a really strong start. This episode is great, mostly because it's wholesome. This is one of the few times that good guy Thomas actually feels genuine, and although the story is Three Strikes, it is probably one of the best Three Strikes episodes ever written. I really like the ending, and the model work, and the aesthetic generally. I know some people aren't a fan of Season 11's yellow colouring, and I do agree that if it had continued it would probably have been a bit tiring, but just in this season alone, it makes it more unique, and gives the season more vibrance and pop. One of the main things I like about Thomas and the Storyteller is actually a very small detail. When Thomas arrives to collect the Storyteller, he looks all around for a grand individual, but realises afterwards that the Storyteller is the woman on the dockside in normal clothes and with a box of biscuits. That is fantastic. It's a really subtle but empowering message to young children. You don't need to hop on the latest trends or have really pricey clothes to do what you love and be good at it. I applaud the writing team for getting that in, and it boosts the episode's wholesomeness even further. Much like Percy and the oil painting in Season 9, this first episode was lovable and cute, and started off the season really well. Emily's Rubbish is also a fun episode, and a good one. Whiff is a fun new character with a unique, if slightly nonsensical design, and I think Emily was a really good character to pair him up with. This episode isn't massively groundbreaking, but it used an interesting cast, Emily, Whiff, and Spencer all playing prominent roles. I also really like the fact that they chose to use a character other than Thomas to introduce Whiff, which is a direct improvement on one of my complaints about the earlier seasons. Dream On is the next episode, and again, it's very solid. It was really nice to see Spencer in a new, shinier livery, and to see him paired up with Thomas was different from the Gordon and Edward stories he'd featured in before. I really like the Sodor Engine's animosity to Spencer here, and although the episode is Three Strikes, it isn't too grievously boring. It's basically a better version of The Great Race's second act. Dirty Work is another fantastic James episode, for the pure reason that his redemption here feels earned. There are other stories in this era which do a similar kind of plotline. See James gets a new coat and Thomas and the Colours. However, This one is better than those, because James learns a vital lesson at the end, that his vanity isn't just dislikable, it's genuinely unnecessary.
You're not cross with me, sir? Even though my flags are drooping and I'm covered in coal dust and quarry dust and fish?
That's a little further than most James stories go, so I like this one for that alone. But now, let's talk about the best of the season, and the fifth one straight, which is really good, Hector the Horrid. Hector the Horrid is an episode I have made a cynical spotlight on, and that video goes over many of my reasons as to why I love this episode, because I love this episode, and you should too. The depth of character that Hector has is the most of any non-Railway series character ever. Thomas is spot on too, that's what my cynical spotlight was about. To sum it up, he's fiery and hot-tempered when Hector scares his friends, but takes things a little too far, and this leads him into finding out the truth, that Hector is very weak inside, and is scared of arguably the simplest job on a railway, the filling of a truck with coal. There were also some returnees in this episode, Bill, Ben, Rosie. It was nice to see that they hadn't been completely forgotten. As a whole, this episode just does everything right. The conflict isn't overplayed, but it's treated seriously, everyone is in character, and it's just a fantastic episode. Probably my favourite of the whole era. This is better than half of the classic series for me, I'll go that far. In my previous version of this video, I didn't mention Gordon and the Engineer once, and that's because at the time, I thought it was quite convoluted and not great. But revisiting it, I like it. It's a very fun and unique concept, which went in a different direction from the episodes around it. It deals with both Gordon's character and with railway principles. It stars a fun cast, including the return of Donald Douglas. Again, please take some time to notice that we haven't had a bad episode this season. All of these first 6 episodes are very likeable for me, and the next couple aren't bad either. Thomas and the Spaceship is definitely a downgrade in terms of writing, featuring a gimmicky concept and a somewhat stupid Thomas. But where I praise this episode is visuals. I love the visuals here. That opening sequence with the 3 big engines at the docks is such eye candy. The glow of lights from the shed, the lighthouse, and Jeremy also feel really warm and inviting, setting the tone beautifully. A poor episode on the plot front, but a really good one visually. Henry's Lucky Day is an episode I'm torn on. On the one hand, it's generic, but on the other, Henry was the perfect choice for the role he had to play. Why? Because in the past, notably with The Wishing Tree in Season 8 and what would later be Season 12, Henry is shown to be very superstitious. I think this fits him. He's an engine who many would say came about through bad luck. The idea of him having lucky trucks, while not exactly high literature, makes a lot more sense to me than having Thomas in the lead again. Besides, this episode looks really nice, and we also see some returnees again, Molly and Rocky. Thomas and the Lighthouse isn't really a terrible episode. It's just one of the ones that pop every once in a while that make me want to sleep. A very uneventful Thomas learns his lesson episode, but it was nice to see the Chinese dragon again, and Cyril as well. Thomas and the Big Bang, on the other hand, is a bad episode. Thomas and all of the narrow gauge engines are very immature here. This is actually bordering on Miller era shenanigans. The sheer level of childishness is really terrible. Enough said. Smoke and Mirrors, despite a cool title, is another boring episode. These few episodes are very unremarkable, and they mark the start of a quality dip in this season. Season 11 is a weird season. It has a fantastic group of starting episodes, and a mostly fantastic group of ending episodes. But in the middle, there's a very clear lack of strong writing. Mostly, at least. We'll be talking more about this later. Smoke and Mirrors is just one example of this. Thomas Sets Sail is one of the few exceptions to this mid-season decline, however. Although this episode is utterly stupid and utterly unrealistic, it's also great fun. I class this one almost alongside Jet Engine from Season 6, although the music and narration doesn't compare, of course. This was another Three Strikes episode that actually worked quite well. Some really interesting characters we used too. Rosie, Elizabeth, Molly, even Cranky, who doesn't get much time to shine in these seasons. The model work is really fun once again, and Sir Topham Hatt in a sailor's outfit is a nice visual touch. A really fun episode. Don't be silly, Billy. You all know why this one sucks. Billy is awful. I really hate him. Why is it that Billy and Nia, who are probably my 2 least favourite characters in this franchise, are both orange? Anyway, we are getting off topic. This episode is the bad kind of Three Strikes, with a very unlikable new character. Whiff and Madge from this season were both great new characters, but Billy was very much an outlier, and I'm glad he doesn't appear again. I also don't know why Thomas felt so bad when Billy got screwed over. He deserved it. Moving on. Edward and the Mail is another Edward is out of character story that is poor, but would have been good with another character. The plot of this one is again fairly decent. An engine who the others view as wise struggles with a job they've never done before, and has to realise that no matter how wise you are, there's always something for you to learn. That's a strong moral, but it's again spoiled by having Edward used as the one who learns it. In terms of potential, great episode. In terms of execution, bad episode. Hide and Peep isn't exactly thrilling. It doesn't have depth of character or cool dialogue, but it does have some really cool visuals. There are some really unique shots in this one. Cranky looking off to sea, the massive dockside panorama, these are one-of-a-kind shots in the model series. I also like that Cranky was really actively involved in this one. This is his only major episode in these 4 seasons combined. To be fair, Cranky is pretty difficult to write an entertaining story around due to him being stationary, but this episode actually used that to its advantage and made it a plot point. Like I say, this one's nothing amazing on the writing front, but is somewhat creative and was a pleasant surprise when going back into the rewatch. Toby's Triumph, on the other hand, is really quite uncreative and not a good use of Toby. It probably isn't the most offensive episode of the season in this regard, but I'm not going to excuse it for that. I'm defending this era, but to do that honestly, I have to take stock of its weaknesses. This episode encapsulates the worst side of this era, not because it's utterly terrible, but because it comes across as, well, low effort. But episodes like Toby's Triumph, while they do appear in these seasons, shouldn't characterise them. Thomas and the Runaway Car, our next episode, is proof of that. Thomas and the Runaway Car is really fun, and there's not much more to it than that. It's another stupid story, but it's a stupid story that knows it's a stupid story. There's a sense of awareness here, unlike Thomas's frosty friend or whatever. It was nice to see Arthur again here too, and he got a much better return than the likes of Stepney next season. Not the season's best, but Thomas and the Runaway Car marks the end of the mid-season dip in quality. After this point, there's only one terrible episode. But be warned, it's really bad. We'll get to that later though. For now, Thomas in Trouble. I like Thomas in Trouble. It's the only season 11 episode that I vividly remember watching as a kid, which is weird because I definitely worked my way through most of this era when I was younger. So although I'm probably biased, I do like this one. I like the way James's teasing prods Thomas to overwork himself. I like how Emily is so concerned for him. I like Thomas's stubborn denial. Everyone with a role to play here plays it well, and I cannot mark this episode down too much. It's slightly fillery, but it's enjoyable filler. Thomas and the Stinky Cheese is a dumb episode, but ironically, very funny. Although I do not like Diesel, Ari and Bert in this, it completely strips them of all intimidation, Thomas's disgusted face is funny as heck. The opening sequence is also really pretty. A stupid episode, and not self-aware like Runaway Car, but a novel one for being used to test CGI, and ironically enjoyable. Percy and the Left Luggage is a story I actually kind of like. I think it would fit better earlier in Percy's arc than season 11, but that's a nitpick. Yes, it's formulaic and boring, I get that. But there's a moment in here I really like, and that's Edward's unflinching decision to help a friend, and managing it quite capably. This is one of those rare and fleeting occasions that the hit era got Edward perfect, and that alone should be praised. There's also some really fun camera angles and sets in this one. I really like that church that Percy goes past, and it was cool to see the airport again after a bit of an absence. Skarloey Storms Through sucks. Like, it's really bad. Skarloey is so childish here, it wouldn't even work set 100 years in the past. The scenario itself isn't terrible, I guess. It might have worked okay with a different character, maybe? But this is Skarloey, and I don't get that. Throughout this video, you'll have heard me say things like, such and such an episode isn't gravely offensive or a sin against the franchise, just kind of poor. Well, this episode is gravely offensive, a sin against the franchise. This episode is a giant middle finger to Audrey, to Britt, to Mitten, and to everyone who brought this character to life. I hate this episode so much. Definitely in my bottom 10 Thomas episodes ever. Probably bottom 3. But, dare I say it, the next episode makes up for it. Cool Truckings is so, well, cool. Man, this episode is cool. Duncan and Madge playing Forza Horizon 4 around steep ravines and lethal areas? Sign me up. Madge is a really good character, and the only hit character to get a consecutive two-parter in her introduction. Cool Truckings is great at setting her up. She's simultaneously motherly, and a bit too easily swayed by what Duncan wants. Madge is quite complex, and this episode makes it clear what she's about. The model work here is also really solid, and there are some tense moments sprinkled throughout. An S-tier episode, 10 out of 10. This episode showed that the franchise was still capable of amazing quality, even with atrocities like Skarloey storms through. Madge's two-parter comes to a close in the next episode, Wash Behind Your Buffers. The title is childish as heck, and the episode as a whole is childish as heck, but I think that's okay. It reinforces Madge's character fairly nicely, and again there's some stunning set design here. The main thing I have against this one is that it's quite convoluted. There's lots of muddying and cleaning and muddying again, but overall, decent. Duncan Does It All was never an episode that would set the world on fire, but again, I like it. This is Duncan's finale, showcasing how far he's come since his grumpiness and attitude problems in Season 4, and boy, has it been quite a ride. Duncan here is well-meaning, but is still shown to have some ways to go. The theme of Duncan wanting adventure and trying to find it, only to be brought back down to earth, is something they really pushed in these seasons, and I like the concept. You're probably sick of hearing this by now, but again, nice model work. Sir Handel in Charge is a really good episode. In some ways, it's the narrow gauge equivalent of The Green Controller. It's funny, and is somewhat of a swan song for Sir Handel, his last major role, ever. Much like Duncan Does It All, it showcases how far he's come, and how far he still has to go. A nice, fun, lackadaisical episode, very slice of life. I hate to end on a bad note. I really do. But Ding-a-Ling is a bad season finale. I feel I'd be doing you guys a disservice if I tried to force out one more positive review here. Ding-a-Ling is a typical Sharon Miller episode. It degrades Freddy, it's 3 strikes, it's boring. And most of all, it's a bad last episode of fully Model Thomas. It's not as grievous as some this season, but I can't hide the fact that it's poor. A forcedly wholesome ending, poor characterization. I just can't like this one. It's one last black mark on what I would say is a good era. Well, that's all the Hit Era episodes reviewed. But before we wrap up, we still have to talk about the finale of this era in more detail. Season 11 has some issues. In my opinion, it is an improvement on Season 10, but it suffers from 2 main problems. First of all, there were more poor choices made with how to write Skarloey and Rhaenys. Other than Push Me, Pull You, which we aren't discussing in this video because I don't count Season 12 as a fully hit season, I think Skarloey Storms Through might be the worst Skarloey episode ever. I also feel that the yellowy filter doesn't fit the Skarloey Railway too well, although that's slightly different with the standard gauge stuff. Although the other SKR episodes are decent, for me this is still an aspect that does drag the season down. However, the main problem with Season 11 is the quality dip. I don't know if it was just because they were writing and filming for The Great Discovery at this point, but the middle of the season has many more bad episodes than the beginning and end sections. Thomas and the Big Bang is a perfect case study of what I'm talking about here. If you were to compare it to the likes of Hector the Horrid, or even something a little more standard like Duncan Does It All, I don't think you'd believe they were in the same season. Season 11 has actually gone down in my estimation a bit since I last saw it. There are some episodes here that are just very forgettable. Not all of them are necessarily terrible, but Hide and Peep, Smoke and Mirrors, Percy and the Left Luggage, Toby's Triumph are all examples. I think a lot of people see these boring episodes and actually push the blame onto seasons 9 and 10, arguably much more exciting seasons. The boring element only shows up to this extent in this season, and yet people always assume it's a problem with the whole era. Well, you know what they say, when you assume you make an ass out of you and me. So those are my gripes with Season 11. There aren't very many, but they do drag the season down more so than in Seasons 8 or 9. Those seasons had, numerically, many more flaws, but Season 11's were more damaging, notably the quality dip. But I still admire this season, and I defend it. Why? The main reason I love Season 11 is quite simple. It's a great finale season. A great season generally, but particularly good at being a strong finish to the full model series. Although I doubt this was intentional, I think a lot of characters get really strong endings to their arcs here. There were a handful that didn't: Skarloey, Percy, Edward, Toby. But Thomas, Sir Handel, Duncan, Gordon, Donald and Douglas, Henry, Emily, James, the list goes on. A lot of characters reached a nice defined endpoint here, and that's something I praise this season for very highly. Even if some of them didn't quite work, it was a clear effort to give everyone something to do this season. This season has an incredibly expansive cast. Season 11 is also quite good at humour. It's no season 5 or 6, but it's decent. Thomas Set Sail and Runaway Car are both whimsical and fun, not to mention cool truckings. Speaking of cool truckings, the character introductions this season, and the characters themselves, were a massive step up from season 10. Yeah, sure, Billy sucks, but the other three all have something to them. Hector is Hector, see my recent Cynical Spotlight for more on him. Madge gets a two-parter, something we hadn't seen properly since season 4 at this point? Wow, that's a long time. Madge was the first character since Duke to get a two-parter. Whiff is a little less interesting, but he has a cool design, and his debut makes really good use of Emily. Season 11's yellow filter would have gotten old quickly, but because it's confined to this season, I like it, at least for the standard gauge stuff. It makes the season pop a bit more, it stands out the most. If you didn't know the episodes of each one, you probably couldn't tell seasons 9 and 10 apart too much, but season 11 stands alone, and I respect that. The model work here, again, is also impressive. Is it season 4 level, or even season 9 level? No, but it was never going to be. Much like season 9, there were some unique and new locations in this season, which gives it just a bit more depth. Season 11, ultimately, is a good finale season. It does some stuff wrong, like every season of Thomas ever, but overall, it concludes each character's full model journey in a very, very satisfying way. 3/4 of the new characters are good, and strong humour and model work are the cherry on top, which seals this one as a good season. And, wow, that's the whole Hit era reviewed. In my last version of this video, I shortlisted some episodes from these seasons that I rank even higher than the rest of them. I know that you'll all want me to do a top 10 episode segment for this video, and who am I to refuse the will of the people? So I present to you my top 10 Hit era episodes. 10th place, Flower Power. 9th place, Cool Truckings. 8th place, The Magic Lamp. 7th place, Duncan and the Old Mine. 6th place, It's Good to Be Gordon. 5th place, Thomas and the Statue. 4th place, Squeak, Rattle and Roll. 3rd place, Duncan's Bluff. 2nd place, Respect for Gordon. Some honourable mentions include James the Second Best, Mighty Mac, Halloween, Percy and the Oil Painting, and a ton more. And now, the best of all, the greatest episode of these 4 genuinely decent seasons is Hector the Horrid. Something quite interesting that you might notice about this list is that Gordon and Duncan pop up quite a lot more than other characters, and I think that's important to note. The Hit era wrote better for characters that were already super flawed in the classics. Duncan, Gordon and James are probably the 3 most accurate and best characters in this part of the show's history. I love the episodes on this list, but there are so many more I could have put on. This era isn't short of strong episodes, and reducing them to 10 plus a couple of honourable mentions was really difficult, perhaps even more difficult than it would be for the Brenner era. Well, now that that's done, let's move on to a short conclusion. A lot of people say that the Hit era was mostly bad, but had a couple of good moments. I disagree. The Hit era was mostly good, but had a couple of bad moments. I hope this defense video has been a clear and accurate representation of my arguments, as well as a look at some episodes you might not have paid much attention to before. Before we wrap this up, however, I'm just going to leave you with my defensive arguments for each of these seasons. Season 8 simply had really good episodes, and a lot of them. It took things back to basics, focusing on the core characters but not forgetting the secondary ones. Season 9 had some real problems, but its successes were massive and expanded past Season 8 with new concepts. Both the model work and the action was better here, and I think the new characters were actually pretty decent. Season 10 broke the canon a fair bit, but it did present some fantastic character dynamics and really complex and dynamic morals. It continued in the same vein as Season 9, just with slightly lower lows. Season 11 was the last all-model season, and it tried to fit in everyone it could and give them a solid end to their arcs, and for the most part, it succeeded. with some really strong humour and some fantastic new cast members. All these seasons have flaws, sometimes big, gaping, horrible flaws, but they also have real gems. And these 4 seasons, I truly believe, are a window back to a time when Thomas, while flawed, was still just about more than a kids show. And that is why I defend the hit era.